Well, hello and welcome everyone to a very timely masterclass to help you identify and eliminate your three most crucial retirement risks. Now, why are they so crucial and why are so few people aware of what they are and how they work? First of all, I believe it's really because all the risks, especially these three, are multipliers and therefore affect all other retirement risks, which we'll touch on later. And most are obviously unaware because there's so many different opinions, along with a lot of conflicting information, right? And that's where the real math and science often get lost in the shuffle, and you end up suffering. So that's why we condense some of the very best wisdom from some of the most reliable sources. And one of the great sources I'm referring to is a very special guest here who will be joining us right now. So please welcome here my friend and soon to be yours, Charles P. Welby. Charles, thank you for being here.
Hey, Frank, thank you. Appreciate it. Hey, I'm curious, how many risks can actually derail your retirement? What would you say?
Well, if you're going to get right to the bottom line there, I'd say we'd have to look at about 18. Why do I say 18? Because if I just go right to the Thrive Income Distribution System, which was founded by our friend and colleague, Curtis Cloak, and now embraced by the American College, there's a total of 18. So Charles, let's introduce everyone just to take a quick snapshot of those 18.
Sure.
Again, only three of them are the multipliers. Any thoughts you have?
Yeah, so I mean, you got 18, three of them are risk multipliers, as we'll go through in a moment. But I'm just curious, like if we look back, over maybe the last 10 years, why have so many retirees, how come they're left to struggle while others are flourishing, in our economy? Do you have any thoughts on that, Frank?
That's a great question. And I know it's a sensitive one too, because if we really describe a big issue in few words, I'd say if you look at this cartoon here, Charles, back in the last deep recession, going back to, God, 2008 and 9, which we still have some reminiscence of today, as you can see, Ben Bernanke back then needed to drain interest rates. Why? In order to help recover housing, pick up Wall Street again, enhance corporate profits, and help revive the overall economy. All right. And if you notice, the stranded people in the sailboat on the right remind me of a typical, in some cases, do-it-yourself couples who retired a decade ago. They assumed they could just live off at least 4 or 5% interest. In their minds, they were in great shape. Sadly, though, their essential income that they needed to pay living expenses shrunk down to under 1% in many cases. And even as interest rates creep back up to fast forward to today, they were still pushed back even further by inflation. So that was a big issue, big question there, Charles. Thanks for asking. But in order to prevent these types of problems, there's three questions I'd love to share that people should really be asking. Charles, can you just share some of those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what would happen if unusual market volatility caused a permanent reduction in your investment accounts? Think about that for a moment. And secondly, what would happen if your living costs doubled or even tripled throughout your retirement? And lastly, what would happen if the IRS decided to take a larger portion of your income distributions? How would you feel?
Those are very scary questions. And I know, Charles, you often remind people that when you're looking at the retirement accounts, the IRS often owns a big part of that. Is that still true?
Absolutely. They're your silent partner in your retirement account.
So with no further ado there, the question now might be, what are the three most crucial risks? I just want to introduce everyone to risk number one. All right, risk number one is, will your money outlive you or will you outlive your money? If you notice, Charles, there's only two doors people are going to walk through. What I'm wondering is, it really seems like it's such an easy choice, but we already know that over 80% of people out there go through door number two. All right. And I think it's very debatable why people are on the wrong path. Can you explain maybe why so many are actually going through door number two as we speak?
Sure, absolutely, Frank. So one big problem that I see is that people often underestimate their own life expectancy. So, I mean, if you retired at 65, passed away at age 70, retirement planning is not difficult at all. I mean, the market could be down by 30%. You could have 10% withdrawals from your investment account balance and no long-term care policy, but it wouldn't matter. You only have 5 years to really take care of. But if you retire and live well beyond age 90, retirement planning is much more difficult, much more challenging. You've got inflation, market volatility, rising taxes, and 15 other issues that, we saw on that previous slide.
Wow, it reminds me of some popular guy I ran into at this golf outing recently I was invited to, and he talked about how, I don't know why he went to me, he talked about how he blew half of his assets and then admitted to me somehow he squandered the other half. I didn't know where he was going there, but I didn't know if I needed to give him the bad news or I was going to turn him over so you could give him the bad news, but he kept insisting he had plenty to retire, but I felt that I had to inform him that in order to pull that off, he needed to die by the end of next month. So I don't know if he's really going to want to talk to me anymore. But again, we always want to be truthful with people. So you're not off the hook, and necessarily if you do die soon, you still could be under a lot of pressure. But with that said, Charles, do you think everyone should get much clearer about how they define money to really not only prevent mistakes, but do the right things going forward?
Absolutely, Frank. I mean, how do you define money in retirement? Do you define it as a principle? You want to protect your principal. Most people, define money that way. How about liquidity? We want to spend and enjoy the money that we accumulate. Accumulation, we all want growth regardless of, whether we're spending it or not. And lastly, purchasing power, which is critical. We want to guard against rising living costs.
Charles, they all make sense. And since they sound so legitimate, what misconceptions do you think cause such a variety of different answers when there probably really is only one answer, which I guess we'll come to very shortly? Do you have any, thoughts there?
Well, let's go through a couple common misconceptions. Misconception number one, protecting your principal during retirement. So you could have $1 million and at maybe 4% inflation over a 25-year retirement period, you've only got $355,000 worth of purchasing power. You just lost 60% of your purchasing power over 25 years due to the silent killer inflation. So that's something to be aware of.
So anyone that comes to you with, let's say they're young in their 40s and they have, let's say, already $1 million and they hit their goal and they're in a 401k, let's say, are they okay if they want to put it in cash? Is this something you would explain to them and say, no, you could be taking a much more dangerous risk?
No, absolutely. They shouldn't have it in cash. Frank, every year, everything you buy is going to cost more. You have to account for inflation.
Right. So they need, even at the risk of volatility, they need to make sure they can leverage asset classes that will help protect future rise in living costs. Does that sound right?
That sounds correct.
Makes a lot of sense. How about the next misconception here?
So another common misconception is having a market focus rather than a plan-driven investment approach. So by that, I mean market focus. I mean, we're all human. Hey, what do we make on our accounts? We're emotional creatures. We react to, whether the market's up, down, or sideways. And it's not good to react. Markets focused people tend to be disappointed investors. The other opposite side of that is plan driven. If you have goals and you're disciplined and you're patient with your investments, chances are you're going to, realize your hopes and dreams, and you're going to be a successful investor by being a plan driven investor.
Great point. I want to hit on this further because going back to market focus, you said there, we know a lot of people, they talk about it at cocktail parties and things, how much they made here and there. They sound very market focused. Have you known any people, longer term investors, as after a decade or two, that have been very successful being a market focused investor?
I really haven't met anyone long term that's market focused that's been a successful investor. Usually short term, is where they're successful. Long term, I haven't met anyone that's consistently successful investing with a market focused approach.
Do you find that's often, I'm using math and science here myself, because when they're trying to time or predict, as your mentor and colleague Nick Murray, who's author of the book Simple Wealth, Inevitable Wealth, a credible behavioral investment teacher, often explains that when they're trying to time markets and trends, they have to be right when they go out and they have to be right again when they go back in. So being right twice is really hard to pull, and nobody's ever pulled it consistently over time. Would you agree with that?
I agree. I remember Nick said that they don't ring the bell twice. So,
Correct.
it's very difficult.
And something Nick also talks about, plan driven. Have you ever known anyone to fail in the long term that's followed this dialogue and been a plan driven investor?
Not at all. I think if you have a plan and you made 6% and didn't have a plan and you made 8%, the plan's going to win because you're going to realize your goals.
No, and to add to that, I know for a fact that if someone had $10,000 just in the S&P 500, I'm not telling people to invest there. 10,000 today since 1970 would be worth approximately north of $2 million. And that includes the fact we've had 3 times, not once, twice, but 3 times where markets had an average recession downturn of averaging over 50% downturn 3 times over that span of time, and still did well. Why? Because those people who were in that asset class, as an example, were plan driven. They had goals. They kept it long term. They were disciplined, and they had to be patient. So those were all great examples, and I thank you for touching on that. But I also wanted to add here, why do you think markets are much more volatile today? Is there a way to just describe that to everyone, just to give a few points? Why do you think things move so much up and down more than ever?
Yeah, well, I mean, today you got electronic trading, there's information overload, everybody's chasing performance, there's algorithms that are, embedded, and news cycle 24/7. I mean, you can't get away from it. So there's too much information today that really is there to help people, but it actually, in my humble opinion, confuses them.
You mentioned news cycle. People can't get away from that. I always remember one of their sayings is, when it bleeds, it leads. All right. They try to do that. And let me just ask you, and you look at everything rationally, you're just so fact-based in so many ways, but even you, as someone who knows this stuff, if you got on an elevator, Charles, and instead of that elevator saying up to the next floor or down to the lobby, it said soar up and plunge downward, would you still take that elevator, or would you run off that thing and take the stairs?
I'm definitely taking the stairs in that scenario, Frank.
Wow, there you go. And that brings us to one more often overlooked misconception. I don't blame anyone for this because I used to overlook this misconception, and that is when and how to take Social Security. Charles, I know we could talk about this as a separate segment if we want, and actually we will do a future presentation just on Social Security, where we may have Ash Aliwal, who's to me the top Social Security advisor in the whole country. Amazing guy. There's always an argument between whether we take it early, like some people's, their friends in the coffee shop might say, or some of the financial entertainers tell everyone under one umbrella, take it later, you'll supposedly get more. But what are some of the mistakes off the top of your head for people who take early? Let's say at 62, where do they go wrong taking early Social Security?
Well, obviously, if they have longevity and they live a long, healthy life, they might be leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars on the table. They could still be working prior to their full retirement age. And if they do that, they're limited to what they can make in terms of income. And then they have to get some of that Social Security benefit back. And then, capital gains harvesting, if we can keep them in a low tax bracket, capital gains tax rates could be as little as 0. And that early Social Security could really be a detriment to those particular areas.
Wow, excellent. I love the point you made about the health, because sometimes, again, people ask questions about that. And we as holistic advisors have to get a sense of what their health status is. Hopefully, if real planning has been done holistically and some update even with medical information, especially if they needed some form of life insurance or long-term care, there should be some awareness of what that health is that helps make better decisions there. Back on the delayed Social Security, that's the one where, hey, I'm going to get a lot more if I wait longer and longer. What are some mistakes that people make that already think or are told if they wait, they'll get more? What are the drawbacks?
Well, I think, no one really knows health-wise, but, if you delay and you die like in your early 70s, you look back and, again, you left a lot of money on the table because you took it too late. So that's definitely not, advantageous. But as you well know, Frank, as we speak, they're currently taxing, Medicare. Your Medicare premiums are really based on your income. So there's mean testing with Medicare, and there's talk that soon there might be means testing with Social Security. The more you make or the more wealth you have, the less Social Security benefit you possibly could receive. And then lastly, like the time value of money, there's no doubt that a dollar today is worth a lot more than a dollar 5 years from now.
Not to scare everyone, but I also read recently, and this goes even from David Walker, the former controller of the US government, who's a serial truth teller. I love the guy. He even indicated, and it's quite verified, that since they don't seem to be fixing Social Security, which is set to go bankrupt in 2032, just so everyone knows, there would need to be at this point forward a 25% average cut across the board in order for that system to be sustainable. So again, that's another reason we're talking about this. We're talking more about the tax effects and things. But again, people who are in higher tax brackets, as you indicated earlier, may want to be very mindful of that. And that might help them make a better decision. That gets me to one big question with you. A typical person who hopefully does an analysis and what's the most optimal way to take it, they're going to be making a commitment to get 12 checks a year. And if they live 25 years, at least one of the spouses, would you say they made a big mistake if they don't have a proper analysis done to make sure the optimal way to take Social Security?
Well, Frank, in that scenario, if they're, 25 years of Social Security at 12 checks per year, they've actually made 300 mistakes, not just one.
Now you gave people 300 more reasons to be scared then. So
Sorry about that.
you're supposed to be here to relax people, but that's okay. All right. So once again, can we share a simple process? Now that let's say they've done the Social Security the right or even the wrong way, all right, and we know exactly what that reliable income coming in is going to be, all right, that helps us solve what we call an income gap problem. Show us that real quick 3 or 4 step process that helps you back into what they really need to solve longevity.
Sure, Frank. I love this formula. It's solving for longevity. So how much capital do you think you'll need to retire comfortably 10 years from now? Well, it's really a 4-step process. Number one, you determine your monthly income gap after your Social Security and your pension if you're fortunate enough to have one. In this example, we'll use $3,000. That's what you need per month to supplement your lifestyle. Then we multiply it by 12 months. So we come up with an annual figure of $36,000. Then what we do, since we're not retiring tomorrow, but we're retiring 10 years from now, we've got to factor in some inflation. And at trendline 3%, that $36,000 is really $48,380. And then lastly, step 4, we divide that by a factor of 4.5%, a factor I feel comfortable with, I know you feel comfortable with. So that determines that if you want to retire comfortably in 10 years and remain comfortably retired, you're going to need a little bit north of $1 million.
Wow, I like the way you included inflation. And I also like the fact that when doing this step, I've seen it before, where that number often comes out much different, north or south, than what some of the people thought they needed. So a great job there, narrowing that gap, because once we're able to solve longevity risk, it really removes a lot of the other risks that we're going to kind of cover and touch on as well. So with that said, I just want to share a few quick insights here. Number one, the first point I want to make that we've learned so far is always prepare for a longer life expectancy. That could be one or just one of the spouses, doesn't have to be both.
Yeah.
Number 2, Charles.
Yeah, focus on protecting your purchasing power throughout your lifetime. I mean, critical.
Very critical. And then now you just basically helped us define what the real definition of money in retirement is. Just a reminder to everyone out there. And number 3, take a planning-driven approach rather than a market-focused approach to your long-term investments. Can't say enough about that. And once you can do those 3, Charles, what's really the big question we can ask?
So the $1 million question is, how would you feel if you could protect against rising living costs throughout your lifetime?
Wonderful. I really appreciate the message there. And that allows us to turn right to the next crucial risk, one that's often overlooked. It's very sneaky. And we call that sequence of return risk, which really can come down to very unlucky timing. That's why I really dislike it so much, but that's why I want to get it off the table, just like yourself. It's almost like a snake. So here's an example. If somebody's down 30%, then the next year they're up 43%. All right. Well, the cumulative return, obviously looks like they're up 13%. So that looks good. Nobody's got a problem. But what really matters that you remind a lot of people of is what the realized return is. Charles, can you walk us through how that realized return works, just so everyone understands, even on layman's terms?
Sure, Frank. So let's do the math together. So you get $100,000. Year one, you lose 30%, you're down to 70. Year two, you make 43%, you're back to 100. So the cumulative return, you're correct, is 13%, negative 30 plus positive 43. But the realized return is a big fat zero.
Wow, so a real life retirement example here is where someone thought they made 13, but from a retirement income standpoint, they really made zero. That's not nice news to hear at all. But just so people aren't nervous, this being a mild example, can you show us at least when this doesn't matter? There's cycles in this phase where the sequence of how returns change as far as volatility, that doesn't really mean much in that phase. Can you show us what that is?
Sure, Frank. So during the accumulation phase, I mean, there's accumulation and distribution. Accumulation phase, sequence of returns risk does not matter whatsoever. We put $100,000 in an investment and we have poor years early in the example A, negative 30, negative 20, and good years later in years 9 and 10, and we flip it. And in the right-hand example B, we had good years starting and bad years ending. It doesn't really matter. We're in the accumulation phase and we end up with the same exact number of dollars.
Wow, now we're going to go right to the distribution phase. Let's say we're taking 6% withdrawals, because there's a big point I want you to drive home here. It doesn't matter then.
Oh, it absolutely matters. I mean, in the distribution phase, it's critical. Same example, you start out fine with 30 and 20, and you end up poorly with negative 20 and negative 30. But since you started out fine, the sequence of returns risk doesn't really matter. You kind of end up where you thought you would end up with, about $106,000. However, on the right-hand column, where we started out poorly, we never really recovered. And we're taking our $6,000 a year out each and every year. At the end of the 10th year, our ending value is less than $40,000. We just lost 60% of our principal because of sequence of returns risk.
And what's worse is neither one of these cases, in real life that is, did they know there was going to be a sharp downturn or uptick early on. Neither of them knew that. So it really came down to unlucky timing, which once again permanently changed the outcome for one of these two situations. And for those people out there that can't rely on luck, and I think a lot of us feel that way, we don't want to have that kind of risk sitting on the table. So again, thanks for making that point and driving it home for us. With that said, I would really love it if you could just show us a quick example of a process that simply takes that kind of risk off the table. Can you just explain that to us real quick?
Sure, the money cycle. So most people go directly from accumulation to distribution. What we do in our process is we build this preservation phase. And if you build the proper amount in that preservation phase, sequence of returns risk during the distribution phase absolutely disappears. It's not going to be an issue. So preservation is really critical. And most plans don't have that piece built into it.
Because some of the money that's needed, guaranteed money, isn't caught in the volatility then, correct?
Correct.
Correct. And with that said, I'm going to jump right over here, and I have next a sample of the process that's used effectively, not just by both of us, but even in our mastermind group, some of the top holistic lifetime income planners in the whole country. All right. And I just want everyone to see this real fast, because if you see here, Charles, we had 3 different time horizons, right? The now, soon, later. Take us to the now, Charles. Just describe the now bucket in a few words, and maybe what the risk or the danger is in that part of the bucket.
Yeah, sure. So the now bucket is for money that's safe and liquid that you're going to need sooner rather than later. And generally speaking, Frank, that is in probably a money market account, maybe a short-term CD. We want it safe. We want it liquid. We want it there when we need it. That's really critical. Some of the problems that I see, though, in the now bucket is people might put money in stocks and need that money sooner rather than later. And if the market goes down, guess what? They lost their principal. It's not a good thing to put equities in your now bucket.
Yeah, I had a buddy that just before he got married, he had an extra $30,000, which was really designed for the wedding. And he wanted to make a quick profit because the market was hot at that time. And I said, well, I'm not going to help you with that. No way. And I know his wife and everything. And he ended up doing it on his own. The 30 went down to 18,000. And he was so embarrassed, he was apologizing to me. I said, don't apologize to me, apologize to your wife. That was now money that you shouldn't have invested. So in real life, that happens to people. We got to be mindful of it. Now, the later bucket, on the other hand, where you did have a time rise and where even he would have made out great in the particular investment he jumped in. How would you describe the later bucket? What's the purpose and what's the danger there?
Yeah, so I mean, the purpose really is growth and legacy. You want to grow your money, you want to leave a legacy for the money that you don't spend. But some of the problems I see in there, maybe the major problem is people that are afraid of volatility have money in the later bucket in cash. And to me, I mean, we saw earlier inflation and, we need growth in our portfolio. That's a big no-no.
Right. And also a big no-no is not having that legacy include the spouse, because the spouse usually is the most important part of that legacy. So well said there. In other words, a time horizon in asset classes that could be volatile, that offset future rise in living costs, can be dealt with without any of that inherent sequence of return risk if you have it separated based on money that's designed more for lifetime rather than just in the near future, correct?
That's correct.
Right.
Absolutely.
And lastly, I think you describe it correctly as the most important cycle here, the overlooked one too. That's the soon bucket. Tell us a little bit about the soon bucket, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so the soon bucket's where we have our income gap. We're pulling the money for our income gap from that soon bucket. So generally speaking, the floor is zero. It's never going to get below zero. And maybe we're not going to make that 7, 8, 9% rate of return because it's invested conservatively. But the key is having that soon bucket allows us to put the remaining funds in that later bucket for growth and legacy. And it's really like a great, process for people to really take their emotions out of their investing.
Right. And I know sometimes when the later bucket over time, like markets have been positive more than they've been negative, you've been able to take appreciated gains and sometimes then put them later into the soon bucket to switch those growth assets into income assets to help provide and manage future cash flow as living costs keep going higher. Does that sound accurate?
Absolutely, for sure.
Perfect there. So with that said, I think that's a great example. Really appreciate you showing that. And that brings us to key insights and issues here. Number one, build a preservation phase in your money cycle. Makes sense. Charles, what's the next one?
Yeah, so you want to pay your essential living expenses with that guaranteed income or that predictable income in that soon bucket.
Excellent. And number three, begin maintaining a longer term investment allocation in the later bucket. That sounds redundant, but I believe me, I want to repeat it. Even Warren Buffett often repeats this himself. And when the media asks him, hey, you already told us that, he says, I'm telling you again to make sure you understood what I said. So same thing there. So with that said, Charles, what's the most important question that we can then ask?
So, to wrap it up, how would you feel if you could not only avoid being harmed by market volatility, but potentially benefit from it? Wouldn't that be something?
Excellent. It kind of means that it's not so much what markets or what the economy does, it's what you do in response to whatever's happening. So you always have the availability to benefit by the fact that these cycles over time are very predictable, while in the short term, these cycles are never predictable, correct?
Correct. Absolutely.
Well, I'm going to get to one thing that is predictable, unfortunately. That's the last risk. And this is where, I never like to sound like a Scrooge, but I feel like we're always, when we discuss this subject, we're introducing each other to the dreaded ghost of retirement future. And that one big ghost is income tax risk. All right. I know it hits home with you, Charles. If you can share with us some of your thoughts on just 3 examples here, please take it away.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, higher future taxes are right around the corner. For the most part, I don't think too many people will dispute that. And then itemized deductions are definitely going away. I mean, I've read an article recently that I think it was 2020 tax returns, over 84% of the people did not itemize on their tax return. And then thirdly, elimination of the inherited stretch IRA for non-spouse beneficiaries. What that means in plain English, Frank, is that most people who inherit an IRA are going to have to clean that out within a 10-year period.
And just so you know that, and I'm going by one of your other mentors, Ed Slott, the top CPA in this area, who even the Wall Street Journal acknowledges the #1 source of advice for retirement tax issues. Ed Slott, CPA, has often pointed out that the stretch IRA he considered the second best benefit in the tax code, which I really understood the more I studied it, how you can transfer wealth to the next generation in a lower tax bracket and continue beyond. Now that they eliminated that, it kind of changed the order, which we'll cover a little bit later. I also want to comment that you mentioned itemized deductions going away 84%. What that means in layman's terms, everyone out there, is there's things that they're not deducting anymore, some of which charity, which I know is limited to $300 to $600, depending on if they're married, that there's other contributions that they're not deducting because the standard deduction's higher. So they're not getting any benefit from that additional outlay, correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I mean, state and local taxes are limited, and medical has always been limited.
Right, right. So again, that hits everyday people and every year and so forth. But the big question here, and we'll cover it real quick. Would you say this build up where we have all this future debt and all these increase in taxes, would this another response to the pandemic, like all the other spending recently these last few years, or was this building up for a long time?
Nah, Frank, this is like pre-COVID figures. So if we look at the red down the bottom here, 113 trillion, right? That's the real deficit. Most people think it's 31 trillion, 32 trillion, but you and I have an accounting background. And when we do things on the accrual basis where we book future promises and future obligations, it's not 32 trillion, it's 113 trillion. And what that equates to is $737,000 per taxpayer, right? And I don't know about you, but with figures like this, I got to give our federal government a big fat F.
Wow, I'm going to go an F minus. Not that I'm trying to outdo you or anything like that. And this comes from Truth in Accounting. And some of those numbers get worse and I think next time we'll give an update. If you talk to David Walker, I mentioned earlier, the former controller, he has his own analysis of that too. So I think we were being generous showing the Truth in Accounting version, and we move forward. It's even worse today, and we'll cover that later, but I think it's great that you gave us some perspective there, that this problem has really been out of control, not only before the pandemic, but I can remember when I first was exposed to David Walker, it was over 20 years ago, and he was on 60 Minutes explaining that we were heading this direction. I thought he was a little crazy back then, but I've come to learn from reading him, he's quite a serial truth teller. So it's good to have great sources like that. So the question here is, will taxes change in the future? And what's your thought there, Charles? If I gave you a multiple choice.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we did a recent poll with some of our prior attendees. Will they be lower? Will they stay the same? Will they be higher? Will they be much higher? And, I think the results pretty much were maybe 5% of the people thought they'd be lower. Maybe 10% of the people thought they'd stay the same. 2 out of 3 people thought they'd be higher. And then almost 20% thought they'd be much higher. So by and large, 85% of the people think they're going to be higher or much higher. And I tend to agree with them.
Well, I'm just glad you and I weren't alone in that 20% figure. So that's good to know. I'm just going by math and science. With that said, there's some key questions here worth asking. And believe me, this is something we all want to pay attention to. Are taxes on sale? Well, granted, if you look historically, if you look at this chart based on the highest tax rates going back since 1913, you'll see they seem to be on sale. Quick question for you, Charles. I like to take that CPA hat and test you a little bit here. I remember in the 50s that Ronald Reagan, well-known actor back then, was always doing 2 movies. Keep in mind, this is in the 50s when the highest tax rate was 90%. He did 2 movies, made $100,000 each. That's $200,000 he made. And after 6 months, he stopped working. And let's say he came to you and he said, Charles, I already did both movies, but now they're going to have me do another one. It's only going to take 3 weeks, and they're going to do it right at my ranch in California. This is perfect. He's all excited. He tells you about it. Do you congratulate him and just make him feel good, or do you have to give him some bad news?
Well, I don't know if it's bad news, but I tell Ronald to take the rest of the summer off. Because Frank, if he did that 3rd movie and he had another $100,000 of income, the federal government's getting 90% of it. And I believe that he's from the state of California, where their top tax rate is 13.3. So by working that extra movie, according to my math, Ronald Reagan would actually owe money by doing that extra movie.
So he doesn't keep any money. He actually could owe a little bit and not even make any money just for doing an extra movie.
Correct.
Wow, unbelievable there. So Again, the question here is, how much time do we have? All right, number one, this is a great question, Charles. Here are the individual tax rates last year. Single
Right.
people to the left, married people to the right. Why? Tell me real quick why the green is so good and why the red is so bad.
Well, obviously the green's so good because the tax rates are lower, right? But what a lot of people don't realize, Frank, is that when you're in that green zone, your capital gains rate is zero, right? And then obviously the less income you have, the more you qualify for tax credit. So, green is important, all right? The red, red's not so good, obviously, because you're paying a higher tax. There's surtaxes on some of the taxes. There are means testing, not Social Security, Medicare, as we mentioned earlier. And you really never know what kind of cash flow you're going to have when 37+% is taken off the top.
And you're mindful of this when it comes to retirement distribution planning, which is a big focus you and I both teach. Can you just make a quick comment here in terms of how you exactly design the income to make sure that income's tax efficient? Because that's what the IRS is really going to try and take.
Yeah. Now, Frank, this slide is worth, this is like, the most beautiful slide. I mean, it's so simplistic. What we try to do in our planning is that if people need income over and above the 12% tax bracket, what we attempt to do is pull it out of tax-free assets, so to speak, so that we can always keep them in the 12% or below tax bracket. So that's really critical, is really to diversify not just your investments, but where your assets are located.
Correct. That's excellent. And I noticed that. And again, people really love seeing this. I'm glad to be showing it to everyone here. And it also keeps us mindful. Some people hate paying any taxes, and I'm proud of it in some ways, but in other ways, I think sometimes I created a monster when I bring this up, because I know one married couple, the husband, hates any kind of taxes, and the wife loves avoiding paying any kind of taxes. So they really want to be in a zero bracket. This has happened more than a few times. With that said, do we just have to tell them off the cuff, just put everything in a Roth IRA, convert, pay the taxes now so you never pay again? Or can we at least leave some of those assets there?
That's a great question, Frank. So if you're single, you could have approximately $350,000 in your pre-tax accounts. Why? Because once you hit that magical age, whether it's 70 or 72, you're required to take out roughly 4% of your account balance. So if you take out 4% of $350,000, being single, that's a $14,000 distribution. But we all know that if you take a standard deduction, which 84% or more people do, you got a $14,000, $15,000 deduction. So the tax on that IRA distribution, if we hold it around 350, is actually zero.
Wow, that's beautiful. So conversely now, and this is a great question, if let's say you have a younger person in their 40s, they're not in a high tax bracket, but they have a lot in qualified assets, like $750,000. All right. Should they then be making Roth contributions into the Roth 401k? Would that be where they should be going completely?
Now, if they're married, they can double that to $700,000, because their standard deduction is double. It's not 14, it's 28. So if somebody only had $250,000 in the retirement account, they're still working, I would advise them to perhaps put that extra money that they're making, via their W-2 into a 401k, get that deduction today, so that eventually when they take the tax out in retirement, if they have their assets properly located, their tax could be a big fat zero.
That's a great point. In other words, if a married couple, I want to get back to that again, a married couple only has $250,000, let's just say, in a qualified plans or in a high tax bracket, they're near retirement, they should max out on the 401k, because if they're well below, at least in last year's case, within 700,000, and they're going to take income from that, they're going to pay zero tax, correct?
That's correct.
I'll set the standard deduction. On the other hand, just to be clear, if they're single and they're in a low tax bracket and they have a lot of money in qualified plans, they should be only contributing to Roth and even converting where they can, convert as many assets over into a tax-free environment, especially if they hate paying taxes, correct?
That's correct. Absolutely
Right.
correct.
I'm just glad we elaborated further, because this is a question that comes up a lot. Even some of our tax attorney friends often remind me and bring that up, that I get another call. They get calls, people asking that. So anyone out there that's making those calls, I hope this was a help. But to go further, I also wanted to say, hey, where do we start here? All right, so just to give everyone a quick intro, Charles, I know you love this one too. There's basically three different types of funnels. Assets fall into one of these three. The pre-tax could be the 401k, the post-tax could be a regular bank account, and the tax advantage, typically a Roth plan would be a great example, or even cash value life insurance. Where do you find, Charles, people have the majority of their assets?
Yeah, so Frank, of all the people that walk into my office, and I'm sure yours too, they have the bulk of their money, their assets, their investments in that pre-tax funnel. And basically, as we mentioned earlier, they have a silent partner in Uncle Sam. So when they take it out, there's going to be a toll charge. So for the most part, most people, have a silent partner in Uncle Sam because they have too much money in that pre-tax account.
Right, and since you know how these funnels are taxed, I'm just going to really quickly ask you, if somebody has 50,000 that went into that pre-tax funnel and it grew to 100 and they took the 100 out, Charles, would they get taxed on most of it or all of it?
They would get taxed on all of it. They got the deduction on the seed, and now
Right.
they're paying the tax on the harvest.
And what if they took $50,000 of post-tax money that already was taxed to grew to 100, they took that out? All
Right,
would
and in that case, Frank, it grew $50,000, it only taxed on the growth because that 50,000 they put in is their tax basis. They already, funded it with after-tax money.
and back to the seeds, if they took $50,000 here of tax-free seeds and it grew to 100,000 in a tax advantage area, how much of that harvest would be taxed?
None of it would be taxed. I mean, that's really the beauty of, these funnels is like, how can we strategically shift money from pre-tax and or post-tax to tax advantage?
Wow. And I want to take this opportunity and just really quickly show a popular example, and we don't have time to go into detail with it, of a mutual people we work with that take 150,000 a year, and they're only paying an effective tax rate under 4.5%. All right. And we actually have used your bucket process along with this whole tax efficiency approach. And I'm going to walk through real quick, Charles, and feel free to jump in. Here we have an example where pre-tax money included in the assumed bucket, Social Security, both spouses are taking approximately 60,000. I rounded it out to make it simple. And their IRA distributions are 30,000, 2,500 a month. So that's $90,000 of income. They're married, they're 65. So far, are we in a low tax bracket?
Absolutely.
Low tax bracket. Okay, that's the 12% marginal bracket. That's important, sir. And they're in that green zone that everyone saw earlier. Next, post-tax. We took $10,000 out of the bank. That's in cash. No tax there, correct?
No tax.
How about tax-free munis? There's no provisional income issues there. That's tax-free, 8,000, correct?
Tax-free for federal.
How about capital gains? There's this one couple we worked with, they have some appreciated assets, excess appreciated. So we just take 1,000 a month out. That's 12,000. How much tax and capital gains do they pay?
No tax as long as they're in the 12% or less tax bracket.
Right, okay, because they're under that threshold. How about tax advantage? 2,000 a month out of a Roth IRA. We already know that's tax free. And I noticed here, because they have some life insurance cash value and a long-term care rider, which was a great idea, because one of three things are going to happen. You live, die, or become disabled. Out of that 6,000, is there any tax there at all?
No tax whatsoever.
The 30,000 is tax free. The other 30 and most of the 90s tax. That $150,000, they ended up actually paying less than 4.5% tax. That's pretty amazing. But if, let's say, they double taxes, the Congressional Budget Office has already admitted they're going to have to double taxes sometime in the future for the country to become solvent again. Sorry to let everyone know this. Would this really hurt them badly?
Not at all. I mean, there's still less than 10%.
Less than 10%. Again, something people would want to be alarmed at if they're not prepared. So this is actually an opportunity for people to know they can become more tax efficient and more optimal from an income and a tax standpoint. So I really appreciate, showing this. And this always reminds me, Charles, because I have to show this quote. People often ask that take less income, Frank, why am I getting hit over the head? You hear that around tax time every year. All right.
Absolutely.
Does this sound like a fair quote? Would you like to read it to everyone?
Yeah. So there are two systems of taxation in our country, one for the informed and one for the uninformed.
Wow. And I know we have a tax managed journey that will be showing in the very near future. Charles, just a quick little snapshot of this. If you have any comments, I know we showed a few examples of the order of money, which we just touched on, measuring your tax bracket, we touched on. And I know you love talking about, which we'll do in that journey, avoiding marginal tax traps, where you show an example of someone in a 12% marginal bracket that got taxed 27%. And CPAs often miss that. I even missed one of those before.
Yeah,
You're going to explain how tax sensitive assets are handled differently, gifting strategies, how you can actually get the IRS to participate in some of the gifting you may do the IRS or family members. Number 6, pay now, later. You know, you talk about the advantage of maybe converting to Roth IRAs is a great example of that. And we just gave an example of managing your dynamic tax bracket. So people will definitely want to see that. And I can't wait to hear some of your input in that area.
yeah. And I mean, the key there, Frank, is like, again, not all money's taxed the same. So, asset location is critical.
Critical. And again, I think people are going to want to tune into that. With that said, some key insights, Charles, and you've really provided a lot of great wisdom here. Start us off.
All right. So, you want to embrace for higher taxes in the near future and throughout your retirement. I mean, higher taxes are coming.
And as you kept elaborating here, Charles, everyone needs to know that they can gradually shift forever tax money into never tax money. One example is some of those partial Roth conversions people do when they retire and they have extra cash and they can control their tax bracket is one example. Or sometimes along the way when they have, depreciated investments, good investments that may be depreciated temporarily, that could be a good time. Again, that's a subject we'll talk about in the next sequence, the tax managed journey. And
Right.
thirdly, Charles?
Yeah, then you want to definitely leverage the bucket planning process with the tax management journey to create greater tax efficiency and really optimize your retirement income.
Right. Well, I'm glad we're able to show an example of a tax return you prepared and show the bucket approach. I think that was a great idea. And Charles, how will everyone feel if they ask this one question?
Yeah, so how would you feel? It's all about feelings. How would you feel if you could control how much of your own money you get to keep?
Wow, it's kind of nice to know that you actually own the assets, not the IRS. Do you know anyone out there to trust the IRS and says, they'll take care of me, or do you think they just want more?
I think they just want more.
Well, again, your mentor, Ed Slot's often he's reminded me several times. He said to me before, he said, Frank, always remember the greatest detriment to your retirement dream will be future increases in taxes. And I used to just shake my head because I knew he wrote a book on it, which I read, called The Retirement Savings Time Bomb. When I read it, I was like, oh, everything's supported here. He's right. And it's also a mindful thing for people, especially that are doing those first two things we showed right. They do guard against longevity. They do guard against sequence of return risk, which eliminates a lot of other risks that we didn't need to get into.
Right.
Then the good news is they're able to control more wealth, but when they do that, they're going to have the IRS come and attack more of it. And believe me, you see it happening every day. So once again, great point. Thanks for sharing. And I want everyone to be mindful. These opportunities not only affect our futures, but those nearest and dearest to us. And when we're not planning right, then some of those people that are dearest to us, kind of like one of your grandkids, when they don't see you for a few days at a time because you're busy working with me or you're out there in the field, they're like, where's Pop, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
then when you get to visit them, which I know that always makes you happy, this is the reaction you get, correct?
Absolutely. They fell asleep.
Exactly. So I want to know, there's a lot of wonderful, loving family people out there, and I always like to remind ourselves what it's all about. And with that, I want to give everyone a chance to take a quick self-evaluation, not on us, but on themselves. I think ranking these 5 critical areas in their lives, whether it's running out of money during retirement and having investment volatility. Some people panic over that, Charles. The increase in taxes, definitely, we just talked about, leaving a legacy, catastrophic care, chronic or critical illness, where they rate. And if you fill out this and you see Charles's email and my email, you can just flip that over to either one of us or both of us. And if you write down some times here, just in case you're one of the first 20 people that send it in, and one of those times fits, we can't promise anything, but we'd be happy to do a quick 10 or 15 minute discussion that you can ask us anything, just as a nice compliment, because we're encouraged about your future. I know Charles is very passionate in this area for sure. With that said, Charles, I'm excited in the future that we'll make sure everyone's available for your tax managed journey that you're going to host in the near future. Can't wait for that one. Any thoughts you have on that one?
No, I mean, it's really like pretty dynamic. I mean, there's a big difference between tax planning, it's one and done, and tax management. It's really like a lifetime, process. So the tax management journey is like an unbelievable journey, so to speak. And
I love the fact people can make it available and share it with their tax advisor. And if you're working with a really a good planner that you like, you really have loved working with, then show that person some of this. Again, I just want everyone out there to have whatever opportunity to be as optimal as possible in this critical area where the climate's changing, and not in a way for the good, and the good for those people that are prepared, not for those people that are left unprepared. So again, with that said, I just want people to feel free. They can also fax to this number here, the 566-4971, just in case they only want to get it through via fax. Once again, the email is fine. I always save some of the last stuff. We want to also disclose the importance of maintaining the highest qualifications and ethical standards. Charles, you're a great living example of this. And that includes protecting you from any self-motivated types of sales practices out there that are promoted, any financial entertainers that we mentioned earlier that may put everyone in the same boat and give the same advice, which can be negative for a lot of people. And of course, the overwhelming amount of incompetent opinions or other types of advice that might come from well-intended people. We want to make sure that you're getting things as accurate and timely as possible. And that includes, of course, being able to have proper legal disclaimers in order to make sure you still know to reach out to your qualified legal counsel, your tax attorney, your CPA, pertaining to any other unique advice that pertains to your own situation. I can't stress that enough. So on behalf of Charles and myself, we really enjoy having you here. And Charles, can you just share any closing thoughts, since you've been so mindful and you're a big reason behind why we even have this presentation?
well, it kind of reminds me of my mom. I've been fortunate to grow up in a large family, great parents. And I remember not long ago, one of my brothers asked my mom, "Hey, Mom, you've been around the block, any words of wisdom for us young people?" And my mother looked at him and said, "Johnny, it's later than you think." So everybody on this webinar, it's later than you think.
Well, I feel like we covered so much here, it did get later than we think, so hopefully people will act right away. So once again, there's no better time for planning your future. And I can emphasize, take some action right now. Don't wait. And thank you for joining us. And we look forward to connecting and seeing you again, and even hearing about some of the progress you've made. We really love hearing that stuff.
Absolutely.
And just hearing your story. So have a great night. We'll talk
Bye for
soon.
now.
Bye for now.